Burned ground. First time I met Lucas Park, the entire town of Ridgewood, Colorado was on fire, and he was standing in the evacuation center making lists. Like the world wasn't actively burning down around us. My name is Tyler Brooks, 27, Wildfire Safety Officer for Colorado State Forestry. I've been fighting fires for 6 years, started as a hotshot crew member, got certified in incident command, and now I coordinate evacuation protocols and fire behavior prediction for the Western Slope. I understand fire the way some people understand breathing. I know how it moves, how it thinks, how it kills. What I didn't understand was how to rebuild a community after fire took everything. The Ridgewood fire started on a Tuesday in September. High pressure system, temperature at 98 degrees, humidity at 18%, wind gusts hitting 40 miles per hour. Perfect fire weather, the kind of conditions that turn a small brush fire into a catastrophe in hours. The fire started somewhere in the national forest, maybe 8 miles northeast of town. By Wednesday morning, it had grown to 12,000 acres. By Wednesday afternoon, it was at 30,000. By Thursday morning, it had become a megafire, the kind that creates its own weather systems, pulls oxygen from surrounding air, moves faster than evacuation protocols were designed for. I was on scene by 0600. Thursday morning, the incident command post was set up at the elementary school parking lot, far enough from town to avoid evacuation chaos, close enough to coordinate response. 20 vehicles, 3 dozen firefighters, 3 incident commanders, and a collection of support staff trying to manage something that had become fundamentally unmanageable. The fire was moving west, pushed by wind that wouldn't stop, pulled by terrain that funneled flame directly toward population. The physics was absolute. Ridgewood had maybe 8 to 10 hours before fire reached the town limits. We're evacuating immediately, I told the town coordinator. Level 3 evacuation order. Everyone goes. No exceptions. No delays. Level 3 means mandatory evacuation. Not a suggestion. Not a recommendation. Everyone leaves, or they stay and take their chances. With fire that moves at 60 miles per hour and burns everything it touches. The roads out of Ridgewood would become absolute chaos for the next 6 hours as 10,000 people tried to leave simultaneously on 2-lane highways designed for normal traffic. It would be dangerous. People would panic. Some would make stupid choices, but the alternative was death. That's when I first saw him. He was standing in the corner of the parking lot with a clipboard and what looked like architectural drawings, talking to the school principal about evacuation center logistics. He was tall, maybe 5'11", with sharp features, dark intelligent eyes, and black hair that desperately needed cutting. He was wearing what used to be khakis and a button-down, but they were covered in dust and ash from whatever he'd been doing before he arrived. We're going to need the gymnasium as primary shelter, he was saying, pointing at his drawings with a pen that had almost no ink left. The cafeteria for food preparation and distribution. The classrooms for medical triage if we end up with injury cases. The library should be partitioned for quiet space. Some people are going to be in active crisis and they'll need calm environments to decompress. The school principal was staring at him like he'd appeared out of thin air. Who exactly are you, and why are you reorganizing my school? Lucas Park, disaster recovery architect. He said it like it explained everything. Like showing up during a disaster with architectural expertise was just something normal people did. I was in the region doing post-fire rebuilding consultation on a previous fire, the Copper Creek incident up north. Finished about 2 months ago, and I saw the evacuation order come through, so I drove here to help. You're going to have 10,000 people flowing into this facility within 6 hours. You need a system for processing them or it becomes total chaos. I've done this before. 3 times. It works. I should have kept moving. I had a fire to coordinate, evacuation zones to manage, real-time fire behavior tracking, personnel assignments, resource allocation, a literal list of things that would kill people if I got them wrong. Instead, I found myself walking over. You're an architect. I asked. He turned to look at me, and something shifted in his expression, a moment of genuine assessment. Like he was seeing something real instead of just registering another person in a chaotic scene. Disaster recovery architect, he said. I specialize in post-fire rebuilding infrastructure assessment, community planning, structural rehabilitation, deciding what gets rebuilt where and how. I also spend a lot of time during the evacuation phase helping emergency centers organize. Because the transition from crisis to recovery is usually chaos. He glanced at my uniform. Your fire service? Wildfire safety officer. Tyler Brooks. I was already doing mental calculations. Fire spread at current rate with current wind conditions. Evacuation bottleneck capacity on Highway 25. Shelter capacity at the school. Secondary evacuation routes if the fire changed direction. The evacuation needs to move faster than your shelter setup timeline. Both can happen simultaneously, he said, with the kind of calm certainty that comes from having done this before. People evacuate out of the region, and we set up the shelter for the ones who evacuate to the center instead of leaving entirely. He gestured at the parking lot vehicles arriving, people running, emergency personnel trying to organize something fundamentally disorganizing. The specific chaos of disaster. You've got maybe 4 hours before this becomes dangerous in a different way. I can get the shelter set up in 2 if I have actual logistical help. I don't have personnel available, I know. You have firefighters, not logistics coordinators. He was already making notes on his clipboard, translating chaos into systems. But the school staff can help, and I need someone who actually understands fire behavior to tell people what to expect. That's your job, right? Understanding fire. It was, and he was right. And somehow, in the middle of a megafire with a town full of people who needed to evacuate, I found myself helping an architect set up an evacuation shelter, while simultaneously coordinating the fire evacuation for the next 6 hours. Lucas and I worked in a rhythm that felt almost choreographed, like we'd been practicing this exact dance without knowing it. He'd identify what needed to happen. Next, bathrooms need supply distribution. First aid station needs to be located near medical personnel. Water distribution system needs to be here, not there. Family reunification needs a separate zone, and I'd translate it into reality, using school staff and volunteers to execute it. He understood how systems should work in theory. I understood how to make systems actually work under pressure, with insufficient resources. With people in crisis. It was like we were speaking the same language that neither of us had learned. We knew. By 1800 hours, the shelter was operational and organized. By 1900 hours, the first evacuees started arriving, families with packed cars, people carrying photographs and documents, and the specific items that mean something. By 2000 hours, we had 3,000 people in the elementary school, all of them housed, all of them organized. All of them alive. The fire reached the town limits at 2,115 hours Thursday night. It took 7 minutes to destroy what had taken 140 years to build. I watched it from the evacuation center's roof, which was irresponsible and definitely against protocol. But I needed to see it, needed to understand what it was doing. The sky was orange, not sunset orange, not fire in the distance orange. Explosion orange, the kind of sky that happens when fire creates its own weather. The air was thick with smoke and ash and something that smelled like burning plastic and wood, and lives becoming smoke. The fire was moving through Ridgewood like a living thing, jumping from structure to structure, creating fire breaks where there weren't any, consuming everything that stood against it, leaving only foundations and chimneys, and the kind of devastation that looks like a bomb went off. By 2,300 hours Thursday, 40% of Ridgewood was gone. By 00 hours Friday morning, 60%. By dawn on Friday, 75% of the town had been converted into ash and devastation. The fire service got it contained by Sunday afternoon. The wildfire part was over, but the town was destroyed. Homes, thousands of them, each one someone's life gone. Businesses, the library, the hospital, the high school, the Main Street commercial district where people had been shopping for generations, all gone. What remained were foundations and chimneys and burned vehicles, and the specific smell of complete loss. I should have rotated out. Fire service protocol says you get relief after a major incident. Get away from the destruction. Decompress. Process the trauma of watching something die in real time. But I couldn't leave. Not with the shelter still operating at capacity. Not with displaced people still arriving needing food and medicine and information about their homes. Not with the town council still making emergency decisions. That needed fire behavior expertise, Lucas didn't leave either. By Monday, 3 days into the disaster, he'd already started preliminary damage assessment. But it wasn't the optimistic rebuilding yet. First came the debris removal estimates, the toxicity testing for ash and soil contamination, the preliminary conversations with FEMA about federal disaster declarations. The first 3 months are just accounting for loss, he told me. We document everything. We deal with debris. We let people grieve. Rebuilding doesn't really start until month 4. He was right. Over the next 12 weeks, we watched the town transform into something unrecognizable, not yet rebuilding, but not burning anymore either. Just destroyed. Debris removal trucks, soil remediation teams, insurance adjusters walking through ash, people sorting through what remained of their lives. By week 12, the ash was being carted away. The soil was being tested. The preliminary infrastructure assessment was complete. That's when Lucas started preliminary rebuilding conversations with city planners and FEMA. Not construction, just planning. The hospital is gone, he told them, showing architectural drawings. But the location was problematic. It was in a low zone with poor emergency access, no defensibility in case of future fire. When we rebuild, and I mean when, because that's going to take years, we should move it further north. Better access, better defensibility. When exactly? The city coordinator asked. How long is rebuilding going to take? Lucas was honest. The hospital, 3 to 5 years minimum. That's planning, permitting, construction. The homes, 3 to 7 years depending on individual resources and insurance. The main street, 2 to 4 years. We're talking a decade of rebuilding for full community recovery. He wasn't optimistic. He was realistic. And it was worse than optimism. It was the specific knowledge that this town was going to hurt for years, over the next 18 months. I watched Lucas work with the city, with FEMA, with contractors and residents and insurance companies. He didn't build anything yet. He planned. He explained fire defensibility. He argued for relocated infrastructure. He translated devastation into long-term vision. I worked alongside him, helping translate his architectural vision into community understanding, using my fire expertise to explain why certain rebuilding choices made sense. By month 18, preliminary construction started on the hospital's new location. The foundation was poured. The steel skeleton began to rise, but it would take another 2 years minimum before it opened. By month 18, we had permits for the first 100 homes, not 300, 100. And they were in early construction phases, framing, not finished. It was slow. It was brutal. It was nothing like the fast rebuilding that seems to happen in movies. We were in the temporary city office housed in the basement of a church that had survived the fire. When I realized I'd completely fallen in love with him, he was explaining fire defensibility, standards to a contractor and a building inspector, using hand-drawn diagrams and physical models made from cardboard and wire. He was exhausted. I could see it in how he held himself, the specific exhaustion that comes from carrying community rebuilding on your shoulders. His eyes were red from smoke exposure during debris surveys. His hands were covered in paper cuts from weeks of sketching. His voice was hoarse from explaining the same concepts over and over to people who'd never thought about rebuilding for disaster. And he was still explaining, still drawing, still believing that this destroyed town could become something better, not just rebuilt, but actually improved, stronger, more resilient. You should go home, I said when he finished with the contractors. Actually rest. You've been working 18-hour days for 6 months straight. So have you, he said, barely looking up from his drawings. And you're still here. That's my job, I said. Fire service doesn't stop because the immediate fire did. There's still monitoring, still assessment, still prevention planning. Rebuilding is my job, he said simply, finally looking at me. And this town isn't rebuilt yet. This town is going to be rebuilding for 10 years. This town needs someone to believe that it can be better. That's what I do. I stay for the long part. I kissed him there in the church basement. surrounded by architectural drawings and community rebuilding plans and the weight of everything we'd lost and everything we were going to build back together over years, not months. He kissed me back like he'd been waiting for this moment, like he'd recognized something in me to the dedication, the willingness to stay after the crisis ended, because the real work was going to take a decade. "I can't promise we'll successfully rebuild this town," he said when we broke apart. "I can't promise it'll work perfectly or that everyone will be happy. Rebuilding after disaster is messy and long and painful. I'm not asking you to promise success," I said. "I'm asking you to stay. While we rebuild, while we figure it out over the years, I'm staying," he said. "For as long as this takes." 18 months after the fire, the hospital's steel skeleton was complete. The first 100 homes were in framing phase. The main street had permits and was ready for early construction. Lucas had established a fire-resilient community design center at the local college, training architects and builders on how to construct homes and infrastructure that could survive the next inevitable fire. 2 years after the fire, the hospital was still being built. The first homes were being finished. Lucas and I were still working 18-hour days, still translating fire science into building standards, still believing that slow rebuilding was better than fast rebuilding. By year 3, the first 200 homes were complete or nearly complete. The hospital's interior construction had begun. Lucas had published guidelines on fire-defensible space that were being used by other recovering communities. I was consulting with FEMA on fire behavior training for rebuilding coordinators. By year 4, we were standing on the ridge that overlooked Ridgewood. The town was still rebuilding, would probably be rebuilding for another 5 to 7 years. But it was alive. Community was coming back. Life was coming back. And it was different than it had been. But different didn't mean worse. Different meant stronger. "We did this," Lucas said, his arm around me, looking down at the partially rebuilt town, new buildings standing next to recovered structures, green corridors cutting through the landscape where evacuation routes would work next time. "Infrastructure designed with fire in mind." "You did this," I corrected. "You understood what rebuilding actually looks like, not fast, but thorough. You made people believe in long-term vision instead of quick fixes." "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "I understand architecture and systems from theory, but you understand them from reality, from 6 years of watching fire destroy, understanding fire behavior at the granular level, knowing what actually works when everything's at stake. You made the theory real, so we needed each other," I said. "Yeah." He was looking at the rebuilt town like he was reading a book he'd written. "We did, we do. Every disaster needs someone who understands the physical world and someone who understands how to rebuild it properly. The fire, the evacuation, the slow rebuilding, none of it works without both." The first time I met Lucas Park, the entire town of Ridgewood was on fire, and he was standing in an evacuation center, making lists about shelter logistics, like the world wasn't burning, but the world was burning. And what I learned over the next 4 years was that sometimes the most important thing isn't stopping disaster. It's understanding that rebuilding after disaster is a decade-long commitment, not a quick fix. It's staying when everyone else leaves. It's believing that something better can come from devastation, not just similar to what was before, but actually improved, stronger, more resilient. And it's finding someone who believes that too. Someone who understands that destruction isn't just loss. It's opportunity to build something more resilient, even if that opportunity takes years.